I'm Nurse Basetta, and I'm here to talk to you about my memories of September 11th, 2001. I've got a few notes that were jotted down. I was living in Syracuse, New York at the time, which is my hometown. And I can tell you that the memories of that day are so vivid in my mind just because I was involved in just not hearing about it, but helping people. It was a beautiful sunny day, and I worked as a nurse in an urgent care / ER PRN, and I happened to be off that day. My son Ryan was 7 years old. He was in 2nd grade, and my daughter Brittany was 10 years old and in 5th grade at the time. My husband was supposed to travel to Tennessee that day, and he left in the morning and then called me later on to let me know that one of his employees was going to go instead. I was meeting a friend of mine for our daily walk around the lake, which is about 15 minutes from my house. And before I left, I was watching the Today Show, and I happened to see, they broke the news, and I saw at 8:45 a plane hit the first tower. And I couldn't believe it. At the same time, my husband had called and had said, I'm not going to Tennessee, somebody else is going in my place. And I just heard that a plane hit the tower in New York City. And at that moment, a few minutes later at 9:06, another American Airlines plane hit the South Tower, Tower 2. And I remember kind of feeling numb and telling him, oh my God, I can't believe that another plane just hit the 2nd tower. So anyways, I got in my car, drove to the lake, met my friend. She had just heard it. There were lots of people taking walks at the lake. A lot of them had radios, phones, and as we were walking, we heard around 10 o'clock that morning that the South Tower had fell. People were just kind of walking around in a daze, just couldn't believe like what was going on. And I can remember saying to my friend, it sounds like the end of the world. And then at 9:43, another American Airlines flight 77 hit the Pentagon. And it was just, like, oh my God, what is going on? I had gotten a call from a coworker of mine who was a nurse practitioner. She used to be the director of the emergency room at St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City. And she mentioned how she had called them and they needed supplies, they needed extra medical personnel to come and help because they figured that there were going to be a lot of casualties, but a lot of injured people. So one of our big trauma hospitals in Syracuse, Upstate Medical Center, was gathering supplies together and medical personnel, and we were going to drive out because planes stopped flying. And from what we could tell, cell phones, at that time, Verizon, AT&T, you couldn't get calls through anywhere. At the time, my cousin, who lived in New York City, she works for Nickelodeon, and it was on the 2nd level of one of the towers. And my aunt had called and was like upset because she hadn't heard from her. Anyways, she did call at 9 o'clock that night. She was in New Jersey. She, along with thousands of others, had walked across the Brooklyn Bridge once the disaster hit. She usually takes the subway to work, and she decided that day, because it was a beautiful sunny day, that she would ride her bike. And as she was riding her bike to work, that's when she saw the first plane hit. And she turned around, and that's when they were like moving everybody away. So anyways, I packed a bag, and my parents were in town to watch the kids and stuff. The school sent out text messages to all the parents to let them know they were kind of in a lockdown mode. The kids were safe. Unless you wanted to come and get your kid, they were keeping them in school. I was leaving the next morning with a group of people. We were going to drive to New York City, and I can remember my son at the time. It's been lots of years, but it still affects you. And I can remember him at the time. He drew a picture in class of the towers, and he said, "You know, Mom," he said, "there's bad guys, but it's okay because we're gonna get those bad guys." So the teachers and the staff did, a great job to try to calm the kids and make them feel safe, because that was the biggest thing, was that kids were having nightmares after this event, because they just didn't have that safe feeling. So we drove to New York City. My cousin, one of my cousins at the time, he is the director for the Import-Export Bank in Washington, D.C. He had called me and said the American Red Cross needs nurses, doctors, medical help, because of blood transfusions, getting in touch with family members. So I alerted our medical director in our group, and I said, if they have too many people in New York, then we can always go there. So we drove. We left real early in the morning. On the Wednesday morning, we got to New York City, and basically what we all figured on the way was that there weren't going to be any survivors. We got a lot of smoke, dust inhalation. The real heart-wrenching thing, and it's really hard to talk about, is the fact that there were people, friends, family members, looking for their loved ones. Just that desperate look on their faces. Looking, have you seen, with pictures, and every place of business had areas where they could just, put up photos, phone numbers. If you see this person, just call. I mean, that was the hardest thing, besides dealing with the fact that you had so many casualties. A lot of smoke inhalation, a lot of the dirt and dust, and I can remember with all of us talking that I said, years down the road, there's going to be a lot of lung cancers and respiratory problems because of these firefighters and rescue workers that are trying to get through the rubble and deal with all this. So basically, it wasn't so much as a rescue as it was a recovery effort. So we stayed there overnight, slept at the hospital, and ended up driving to Washington, D.C. to help with the American Red Cross. My cousin Stephen, who works for the Import-Export Bank, a good friend of his, George, at the time was working for, I believe it was Rumsfeld, and he was telling us how he had just walked down the hallway to deliver some papers to a good friend of his, who was sitting in his office at the desk, and he turned around, walked back down that hallway into another building, and that's when he heard the plane crash through the Pentagon, and unfortunately had lost his friend. But George, a lot of them have gone through therapy and a lot of trying to deal with it, and every year when 9/11 comes along, they're just reminded of what went on. And then what else? Coming back, I stayed through the weekend, and then there were a bunch that stayed, a bunch of us that stayed back in New York, and then there was a group of us that ended up driving back to Syracuse because I wanted to be back with my family. Every town, I think, in America, had prayer vigils and candlelight things, and I know in Syracuse, they had even up to, you know, a week or two later, they had candlelight services in the downtown area. Every church had you know, masses and things, and it was kind of a surreal feeling, because people would walk around, and it was like they would do kind things for neighbors and for friends, but it was like they didn't know what to do, you know, because it was a shock. It was almost like the death of a loved one that you just it's just coming to the reality that you're trying to deal with it, and then there's a little bit of anger inside of you as to why this could possibly happen. And I think the whole idea of 9/11 has just brought a national unity and a new appreciation for those small acts of kindness. And it's unfortunate that it took that for that to happen. And I have a dear friend from college who's a nurse, who lost her husband on the 102nd floor. He worked for one of the big financial companies. And the only thing that she was able to get recovered from that, like years later, that was sent to her in a box, was his wedding band, which is kind of a very surreal thing that was all like it. That was a very important token, but with everything, that was what was left. So every September 11th, I just take the time, I call my friends, I call my family, I call my kids, just to say, you know what, we have to do those small acts of kindness. We have to say we love each other, and we won't ever forget, but just be thankful for every day that we live. Thank you. All right, this is a picture of our newspaper the day after 9/11. Okay, and from that point on, for probably the next 2 weeks, there were pictures, there were faces of people with shocked looks. When I got back, months and months later, the American Red Cross sent me this book of New York, September 11th, 2001. And it's got some very vivid pictures in it of the buildings, the times, all the planes from New York City to Pennsylvania to the Pentagon crashed. So if you want to stop by and just kind of take a look at it, you're welcome to. It's just another reminder of the horrific events of that day. Thank you.
2001. I was a supervisor at Delta Airlines at DFW, and I was managing an area of wide-body aircraft, that's 767s. And those are the same type of aircraft that were actually used during the bombings, right? So I worked, it was a real high seniority era, and the guys I worked with had worked with these airplanes for like 20 or 30 years, a lot of them. They knew, you know, everything there was. And we worked in the ramp area. So we were like under the wing, loading baggage, air freight, cargo, fuel, everything that was involved on the ground handling of these airplanes. And so after the first airplane goes into the World Trade Center, then it's on TV, and everybody in the whole country at that point is watching the TV, because they're like, oh my gosh, there's this airplane happened, you know, crashed, and we're like, what's going on with that? You know, we're trying to figure this out. I've been up to the top of the World Trade Center before, and I figured that what happened, or what I thought might have happened, is an airplane veered off a course and accidentally crashed into the World Trade Center. If you were up in the top of the World Trade Center, you can see there was actually a flight pattern about 1.5 miles off on the other side of the Hudson River going by. It was a private aircraft would land north of New York City, and that was pretty normal for them to do that. So I thought, well, maybe there's an airplane that came off its path and crashed into the World Trade Center. An airplane had actually crashed during World War II into the Empire State Building, and it's still there. It was a bomber during the thunderstorm. But So I thought, okay, this is happening, and everybody's looking at this building burning, and we're like, okay, what's going to happen to these poor people above the fireworks, figuring out how they're going to get them taken there. And everybody's watching the TV, and I'm sitting around, like I say, with all these guys who have worked on these aircraft for forever. And we saw the second airplane go in, all right? And so at that point, Peter Jennings, who's making the news announcement, says, well, apparently we're under attack at this point. He like immediately perceived that this is an attack on the United States. Okay, and so we're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And so they repeated that aircraft going in, the second one coming in, because they had all the cameras in the country were on these two buildings at that point, and so they had every angle to see the second airplane going in. And when we saw that, we're like, what type of airplane is that? We could not figure out what type of airplane this was. We had no idea. Nobody in the room could figure out that was a 767, the very same aircraft that we were like, because it was so much smaller. We're like, maybe that's like a 737, which is like a Southwest Airlines flies, a lot smaller airplane, but the wings didn't look right. We're like, what type of airplane? Nobody conceived that could possibly be a 767, because 767s are gigantic. But this World Trade Center buildings are gigantic, so much bigger than these aircraft, that make those really large aircraft look small. So that just goes to show you the magnitude of the size of those buildings that collapsed. Okay, and the crashes happened while people were on their way to work. Okay, so many people died in this, but had it happened a little bit later in the morning when the buildings were full of people, of course many other people would have died at that time. So now, right after the second aircraft crashed in there, a few minutes later, the president announced that we're going to have national ground stop. That means every airplane that's flying anywhere in the country, in the sky, any type of airplane, lands immediately. All right? Nobody goes to their destination. Wherever you are, land now, because we don't know what the magnitude is or what other aircraft are out there, right? Because there could be other hijacked aircraft, and indeed there were other hijacked aircraft out there that were flying around, right? And so he orders this national ground stop. So that means if an airplane's going from, say, Los Angeles to California to Orlando, Florida, and it's flying over DFW, all right, it has to land immediately in DFW next 10 or 15 minutes. It needs to be on the ground. And every other airplane in the same place. So every airplane is now landing in the wrong city. Not where it's supposed to go to, not where it's coming from. All right, so all these passengers all over the entire country are into the wrong places. Everybody's misplaced, all right, in the entire country. And so, and where we're going to put all these airplanes? We already have airplanes that haven't taken off yet, right? So we're going to have hundreds of extra airplanes landing at our airplanes, and we have to have a place for them. And we've got to be able to get the customers off the airplanes, right? So we needed to move every plane that was on the building off into other places, right? And so I was listening to a radio, and we were hearing what to do operationally. I had a headset on, and I'm listening to what we're supposed to be doing. And I know I need to move, me and this guy named Brian have to move this one aircraft off gate 14 and push it back to make room for other aircraft. So this is a really large aircraft, and it's just he and I. And so we're not listening to everybody else on the radio at this point. We're just, I'm talking to him through a headset, right? And I'm on this little passenger tug, and he's on the jet tug that's pushing the aircraft. So we've manipulated this aircraft back about 100 yards into this little parking spot. We're kind of moving. I'm making sure he's not crashing into something or backing it into something, and it's just he and I. And we're talking to each other, and that takes about 15, maybe 20 minutes, all right? Maybe a little longer than that. I'm not sure about it. We finally finished that. I say, okay, put the brakes on. We set the aircraft on. We finished parking that aircraft. And at that point, then I turned back on my radio, and Brian turns on his radio. We're now listening to what's going on with the rest of the operations. And here's what I hear. Mark Guiney, who's the head of our operations at the time, is like telling people what to do. He calls his boss on the radio. All right, Bob Barley, go ahead, Mark. Well, the second World Trade Center just collapsed. Right? I hadn't heard about the first one or anything else. Now the second World Trade Center has just collapsed. And Brian and I are like, what? What? This entire two buildings completely collapsed, right? And when they collapsed, they took down a bunch of other skyscrapers near them too, right? They completely damaged just tons and tons of acres in addition to destroying these people. So now we have all these. Just have a seat, Angela. Okay, so then we're figuring, okay, what are we going to do with all these customers? They're coming in, and sure enough, the airplanes are landing fast, right? And they're coming in, they need to get off. So we got all the aircraft off the building, the customers, the airplanes come in, They come to the building, we put the jetway on. Passengers get off the airplane, the jetway comes off, boom, the aircraft goes out, another airplane comes in, passengers come in, leave the baggage, leave the air freight, leave everything on the aircraft, just get them in, get the customers off, get the airplanes back out, right? So we do that like most in the morning. Now we're getting the airplanes in. We have now thousands and thousands and thousands of people who weren't supposed to be there up in our terminal. No baggage. They're not supposed to be. They came from, let's say, Los Angeles. They're not supposed to be in Dallas. They're trying to get to Orlando. They're not supposed to be in Dallas, right? And that's what's going on in DFW. And DFW is just one airport, right? And this is what happened all over the entire country. Everybody's disrupted, all right? It's a big, big problem. In addition to all the mass hysteria and the death and everything that's happening to the poor, emergency people in New York. This is what, I can even think about that because we got these other operational issues that are going on. Okay, and so now how are we going to get these customers back to get their baggage back to them, because nobody's got what they're going to do without any baggage. They don't have any clothes. Someone may not have their wallets, may not have their medicines, anything else, right? So we have no way of getting the passengers with their baggage out there because nobody's destination was DFW. Everybody was supposed to be going to all these other places, right? Or those who be coming from these other places. And so we had this gigantic problem of getting these customers back. And we don't know if we can give them their baggage back, all right? Because there might be bombs in this baggage. We don't really know the extent of this thing. So this might be part of the problem. We don't really know that. Can we get these, is it safe to give these customers back their baggage? We might be sending a bomb up into them. Who knows, right? So there's this, they're all stuck with this, right? And so we started eventually severing customers in, okay, if you were going to the eastern part of the United States, go to this part of the building. If you're going to the central part of the United States, go to this part of the building. It could be people from Wichita or Kansas or San Antonio or El Paso. People are, if you're going to the western part of the country, you go to this part. And we started sending bags up, and it took all day long. I went to work that morning at 5 a.m. I started work. I didn't leave until way late, like 9 o'clock. And everybody in the same boat with me was there also. It's like everybody was there trying to help unscramble this gigantic mess that was going on. And so, and then when we're going home that night, we're like, are we going to have a job the next day? I don't know if we're going to have a job the next day. The airplanes aren't going to go anywhere. Are we going to have a flight? And indeed, a lot of people, almost all the airline employees were furloughed for a couple of weeks, all right, until the airplanes started flying again. No airplanes flew for the first, I don't know how long, 2 or 3 weeks, right? Until they could kind of make safe and set up new procedures. And so now here these people are stuck, no way to get home, right? Because there's no airplanes flying home, right? And they're stuck at DFW. And almost immediately, all the hotels are full. There's no rooms in hotels. All the car rentals are gone. There's no car rentals available. For weeks, we're putting people in taxis, sending them to San Antonio, pay a couple $100 to send them to El Paso, San Antonio. We're trying to get people home. At DFW, people came out to the airport. They knew this about the situation. People who lived in Irving, people who lived in Garland and other places came out, took total strangers into their houses, put them out for a week, 2 weeks, or something like that, just to be able to have them a place to stay until they could figure out some way to get them back home. There's no buses, no airplanes. And it was very, very weird because you don't realize how much noise airplanes are making. Okay, well, those couple of weeks when there was no airplanes flying, you could go outside and you could hear things you could never hear inside the city because you don't have that background noise. It was just very eerie, weird experience. So I could probably go on for hours about all the other complexities and things like that. But a gigantic mess in addition, of course, to the other problems that were going on in New